this is actually my first film-related memory, and it was when I was 4 years old. I have a sister who's 9 years older than me who forced me to watch Nightmare on Elm Street with her while she was babysitting me. um, and it's obviously I was terrified, but that kind of was what sparked my love of horror. And obviously after that, I kind of went for more age-appropriate things like Hocus Pocus and Return to Oz and things like that. But luckily, I didn't have parents who censored me a lot, so I definitely was watching a lot of extreme horror stuff from a very early age. But A Nightmare on Elm Street is for sure what started it for me.
Well, I mean, you could argue that something like Return to Oz is even scarier than A Nightmare on Elm Street. Like that whole room of the heads screaming at Dorothy, the Wheelers. I mean, I think those are definitely films that could turn most people into horror fans if they don't traumatize them. But then as you're kind of growing up and you're gaining more knowledge about horror, you're getting into more of the films and everything and exploring the genre a lot more. When did you start writing about horror? When did you start, like, I am so passionate about these films, I want to write about them for other people to, understand why these movies are so great?
Yeah, my writing about film career started in 2015. So it's been almost a decade. We're getting close. And it really just kind of stemmed from I am the obnoxious person who, while I'm watching a horror film, I will mostly say something like, oh, how much you want to bet this is what's going to happen, or this is going to be the big twist. And a lot of the time I end up being right, and it annoys the hell out of my partner. So he was actually the one who initially said that he suggested I actually write horror films, but I did not feel comfortable enough with my skills at that point to do that. So I decided to start my website, the Blogging Banshee, and start writing reviews there. And from there it kind of grew. I eventually started contributing to other places. I think I started in like 2018 was when I started branching out a bit more. And since then I went back and got my master's degree in professional creative writing because I wanted to get better at what I was doing. And now I'm starting to dabble in, on top of film analysis and film criticism, also doing more fiction type writing and very early stages of dabbling in writing screenplays.
Okay. So obviously one of the things that you mainly focus on, you write for the Certified Forgotten. You focus on uterus horror, what is deemed as uterus horror. Kind of explain what exactly is uterus horror, what makes a horror film in that subgenre, and then why you enjoy writing about that subgenre.
Yeah, so uterus horror is essentially a subgenre of horror that obviously has always existed for a very long time, but I define it as films that focus on growing up with a female gender expression that kind of capture what it's like to become an adult and come into your sexuality, and using horror specifically to emphasize a lot of those elements. So things like Ginger Snaps, Jennifer's Body, Carrie, those are probably the three big ones that most people associate with it. And I wanted to focus on this because with coming of age stories, whether in horror or outside of horror, most of the time they focus on the male experience. And I've always been really drawn to these horror films, and I didn't really realize why until I kind of realized that common thread between all the films, and that's kind of what sparked my interest in wanting to write about them and kind of dive into the themes throughout all the films and the commonalities and what makes them different. And it's something that I also am very happy to say we're seeing a lot more of those types of films as well. I usually say Carrie is kind of what started this subgenre, even though there are some films that, whether they meant to or not before that, kind of have those same themes. And then Ginger Snaps was really what kind of re-sparked that subgenre of films. And basically, as soon as Ginger Snaps came out, we started to see an increase in those types of films, and we're only seeing more and more of them, which I think is awesome.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously you've written about other types of horror. When it comes to writing for horror, besides uterus horror, are there other subgenres that you really love to either write about or you just enjoy like watching? Like, or do you have favorite subgenres?
I mean, I love so many different genres.
Mhm.
For just like personal, for just watching for fun, I always like to be scared. And for me, supernatural stuff like ghosts is always the scariest. So I love like haunted house type films. I also am a big supporter of found footage films. Like two of the scariest films for me are The Blair Witch Project and Hell House LLC. Absolutely scare me to death no matter how many times I watch them. But then I also just like, I really enjoy aquatic horror, especially even though this is probably polarizing film, depending on who you talk to, like Underwater, I love that movie. I love that kind of like claustrophobic feeling that you get. And my undergrad degree was in archaeology, so I am also a bit of a sucker for archaeological based horror films like As Above, So Below, movies like that. I also love those.
No, I agree. Found footage in particular. I love that subgenre. Hell House LLC is one of my favorites. Talking with Stephen Cognetti was a really cool experience, getting the chat with him. And like, yeah, that first one in particular is terrifying. But you are also a published author, or an upcoming published author. You are the co-author of a book called Queer Horror, a Film Guide, which is available for pre-order wherever books are sold. So everyone should go pre-order that. But can you kind of talk about how you got involved with this book and kind of your experience of writing it?
Yeah, I was brought in to the project by a friend of mine, Tyler, who is one of the editors, and he also writes for Dread Central. And he just kind of reached out to me to see if it was something that I'd be interested in. And I met with Sean, who is also one of the editors on the book, and he's amazing. We had a really great meeting, and I kind of did like a tryout write-up. I think the first thing that I wrote was for the 2018 Suspiria, which is another one of my favorite films. And it that kind of was how it started. And it was a really interesting project because we each, there are multiple writers on it, and we each wrote a minimum of, I think, 50 entries, and each one was about a different horror film, queer horror film. And it was a very long process. And even like after the writing was done, it's been a very long process. And so we're very excited that the end is near and the book is going to be coming out. We actually don't even have like a firm date yet. Like you said, it's available for pre-order. We're thinking it's either going to be late 2023, early 2024 is when it'll actually be released. But it was a really good experience. Like the other writers that are on the book are so amazing. I actually have only met two of my fellow writers in person. So I'm also excited for when it comes out and we start like doing signings and stuff. I can finally meet the rest of the team. Like I haven't even met Sean yet, but, and it's just, I think it's really cool. And it was great cause I've personally always kind of felt like in the queer space, I've never been like queer enough. I usually use queer to describe myself, like bisexual, pansexual, whatever. It's all of those apply, and I use she, they pronouns. But even then, like I always feel like I'm almost intruding on those spaces, especially since I'm in an outwardly straight looking relationship. So the fact that they brought me on, it made me feel really good. And I like the people that I got to work with are amazing. And the films that we got to write about are amazing. And it's something where even since we finished writing, so many more amazing queer horror films have come out. So even after this comes out, it's not going to be an exhaustive list, but I think last I saw it had well over 900 entries in the book. It might have even crossed 1,000 by the time we finished. I'm not positive. So it's going to be a very comprehensive book. And even then we still weren't able to fit everything in.
So with your contribution to the book and everything, what were kind of the films that you really focused on, that you kind of touched on as like queer horror? Because when it comes to queer horror, I always find it fascinating when it's movies that maybe were not intended to be queer horror, but over time, you know, people kind of reanalyze them, and it's like, it wasn't intentional, but the themes and like the messaging is kind of like right there. So kind of what are the movies that you focused on, really?
Yeah, well, like I said, the first one I did was the 2018 Suspiria, which I had such a blast writing about. Anytime I get a chance to write about that film, I'm going to. But it's actually funny that you talk about the ones that you kind of have to, like, in hindsight, see the queerness in it, because one of the ones that I actually fought to be included in the book was The Old Dark House. And because it's one of those ones where when you watch it, it's not necessarily immediately recognizably as a queer film, but when you dive into the themes of it, and it definitely seems like there's a lot of like queer repression going on, and like very subtle queer relationships and characters, where if you actually really pay attention to what they're saying and their relationships, you kind of put the pieces together. But also the fact that it's James Whale, who was an openly gay man even back then. So that was one that I had to fight for a little bit, because we did try to focus more on films that were a bit more obviously queer and not just subtext. But I feel like because of where it sits in film history, I thought it was a really important one to include. And luckily Sean agreed with me after I pled my case.
Well, I also want to ask then, because you're mentioning with the Universal horror cycle there, I think one that I often look at is Dracula's Daughter. That's one that I think is, I'm curious, is that one covered in the book as well? Because that one is a bit more openly queer, even if, like, I don't know, I don't believe James Whale was involved with Dracula's Daughter.
No, I don't think he did that one, but I that one isn't one that I wrote about, but I am fairly certain that that one is in there, because it's one that I wanted to write about, but someone else had already taken it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's an amazing one. That one is definitely way more obviously queer. I'm sure people at the time didn't realize that, but in hindsight, it is very queer.
Is when it comes to recommending horror films, what is always your go-to answer when it comes to recommending a scary movie to somebody?
Oh, see, I feel like my answers vary so much depending on who I'm talking to, because I always try to cater my recommendations to the specific person's taste. Even people who say they don't like horror, I can most likely recommend a horror film that you would like. It doesn't have to be scary to be horror. But you know, one that I feel like I recommend a lot that isn't Ginger Snaps, I won't pick that one. I would say is probably The Changeling, the one with George C. Scott. That movie, I just feel, one, it takes place like in the Seattle area, and I lived in Seattle for most of my life, so I like that connection. But just that film is a really intriguing story that I feel like will appeal even to people who don't necessarily like horror. But it's also, especially for the time, it's surprisingly scary. Like, I know a lot of people talk about how scary The Exorcist is, and I totally get that it can be scary for some people, but that's a film that's never been scary for me. But The Changeling, on the other hand, that movie, like, it's such a subtle creepiness that just kind of sinks in, and you don't even realize that you're starting to get scared until it's really in the thick of things. So I think that that's a really good one, and it's a very timeless one. And George C. Scott is just amazing anyway, so.